Thanks a lot, Corey, and definitely do not apologize for not using slides. I find it incredibly impressive to be able to talk intelligently for exactly 15 minutes without having slides. I am not as talented, and so we'll use slides. So I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts about these papers. And just as an academic, let me start by just saying, I can't talking slowly until that these are really neat papers. So each of them has a very clever idea and then builds on that clever idea and executes on a really nice paper. So what I will do in my talk is go through and tell you what I think is a clever idea in each of them and give you a sense of the result and one comment on each of the papers. After the clever idea, each paper then has wonderful data and fancy statistical analysis to provide a very, very convincing result. We heard a lot about the cost of regulation this morning, including reporting requirements. One of the benefits of that is all the data that researchers get to work with, and one output of that is three very nice papers here. So I will also try to draw a through line to the papers, and the through line that I will try to pick up is that we shouldn't just think about community banks, but we should think about community bankers, the folks who work at the banks. And I think one takeaway that I get from these papers is a lot of the value in community banks resides in the people who work there. When I learned in grad school, I learned a lot about banks being special and banks building relationships. And what I've, I think, come to learn over the years is that a lot of that value sits in the employees. We create relationships with people, not necessarily with institutions. And I think that through line sits in all three of these papers. Okay, so one result for each paper. So this is a figure that I'm going to go in slightly different order. This is a result that Shohini showed in her paper. And Shohini's result is that when banks set deposit rates, those rates contain information that predicts future economic activity in the local geography. So in this picture, the horizontal axis shows the deposit rates that banks were setting in 2006. Places further to the right, we're setting higher interest rates, higher deposit rates. Places further to the left, we're setting lower rates. And what you find, if you fast forward to 2008, a couple years later, places where deposit rates were higher had worse economic activity. They show, Shohini and her co-authors show that this result is statistically reliable. Deposit rates contain information about future economic activity. The logic is that when banks are setting deposit rates, bankers understand that there might be a decrease in the supply of deposits, and they have to fight a little harder to get them. That's when they set higher interest rates. And that supply of deposits contains information about future economic activity. When we hear Corey speak, we can understand very quickly why this works. He knows a ton about Tampa and that area. When he's setting deposit rates, it incorporates information about what's happening in Tampa. And then it shows up predicting future economic activity. I find this result incredible. It's a very nice way to be able to predict geographic variation in economic activity. It made me wonder if macro forecasters do this. One forecaster is the Federal Reserve. They do this already a little bit. We heard how Corey contributes to the Atlanta Fed. The Fed does this somewhat systematically in a couple different ways. One is through the Beige Book, which is produced before FOMC meetings, where the Fed collects anecdotal information from the regional Feds do this to collect information about the different areas, and they aggregate it up. As part of that process, they collect information from local bankers. So Corey, yes, this is done somewhat systematically. Here's a quote here from the most recent Beige Book. St. Louis Fed talked to bankers. I found this one interesting because they found some conflicting reports. Some places deposit rates seem to be going up. Some places they were going down. But it shows that there is information in this, in what banks are doing. I view Shohini's paper as essentially kind of formalizing this and showing this underlying statistics work. Okay, there's information in these deposit rates about future economic activity. One natural question I think Shohini could potentially answer is whether we can use this information and aggregate it up and say something about the macroeconomy overall. The beige book is feeding into the FOMC process where we're trying to forecast the US economy. And you can imagine doing the same exercise to try to aggregate up what Shohini is showing to say something about the broader economy. Second big result, this is from Dimitro's paper, is that small C&I loan portfolios are valuable. The clever super insight in this paper is that to be able to make that statement is often challenging because many banks are private and we can't observe their market values. The clever insight was we can look at when those banks are sold to another bank and we can see what the acquirers were willing to pay for those banks. That is the clever idea. Then they collect a bunch of data and find this very fascinating result, maybe somewhat intuitive, but put some actual numbers to it. So this is a table that I created. It's not quite from their paper, but it's based on their results. They're essentially comparing target banks that are sold that have low C&I portfolios. So think of a bank that has roughly 3% of its loans in small C&I loans to another bank that has a lot of C&I loans, say 8% on average. So we have like a low C&I portfolio to a high C&I portfolio. And then you go look at the premiums that the acquirers are willing to pay, and you find they're higher for the high C&I portfolio loans. This is the result that they have. And if you dig in even further and you look at the very, very small loans, you see an even bigger premium. So this suggests the acquiring banks are willing to pay more when banks have these small C&I loan portfolios. I find this result fascinating because it suggests that these C&I loan portfolios are valuable not only to banks, but to their potential acquirers. So these relationships persist even when the bank is sold. This is what I find is a particularly interesting result from this, right? There's a lot of academic literature about what acquisition prices are when firms are sold. And a lot of that evidence suggests that if you look at the target price, you can infer the synergies that are created in the acquisition. And so I think it's fair to look at these acquisition prices and infer the value of the C&I loan portfolios to the acquiring bank. And what the result says is that these relationships persist even as the bank is sold. And so I think a natural question there is to think about, well, what is happening to these relationships, particularly what is happening to the employees of the acquired bank. My hypothesis is that in many cases, the employees might stay. This sounds a little bit different than what Corey's thinking maybe with some of the acquisitions that happened in Tampa. But to the extent that they stay, you could imagine that the relationships persist even after the acquisition. If that's true, it could be that the acquisition is actually providing more resources to the relationship bankers, and maybe those relationships get stronger and more valuable, and we see it show up in these premiums. Third, Rohan's paper. This is the one which I think is most interesting in light of the discussion that we had this morning, right? So Rohan's paper is showing that counties that lose a community bank benefit the following. And I put lose here in quotations because this is the language that Rohan and his co-authors use in the paper. But if you look at the result, it seems as if the counties that lose banks, either through an acquisition or through a failed bank, tend to benefit. So the main result, again, this is a table that I created based on the results in their paper. But if you compare a county that loses a community bank relative to an otherwise similar county, you see two things. One, small business lending in that county actually increases. This is a 7.1 percentage point difference. And then if you try to figure out what does that mean for local employment, you'll get an increase of 0.6 percentage points, which is a huge increase in employment. Okay? So it seems like counties that lose a community bank benefit through more lending and more employment. Rohan and his co-authors find this surprising because it does seem to run counter to our intuition that community banks are valuable, and when there's an acquisition, some of that value would be destroyed. So then they dig in further, and they find that these benefits do seem to vary, and they're bigger when there are other community banks that could potentially pick up the slack, or when the acquiring bank is smaller, suggesting it's the acquisition or it's a merger of two community banks. If you look at the results, though, I can't find any sense that the effect is ever negative. So it's not that the sense that there are some places where there is some suffering because of the loss of a community bank. There's just some places where it's kind of neutral and other places where it's particularly high. So this, I think, is a very striking result, saying the loss of a community bank, we really shouldn't think of it as a loss. So should we think of this as really surprising? And so I'm going to argue that potentially this is not quite surprising. The long academic literature thinking about the costs and benefits of merger point to two competing effects. One is that when firms merge, there's a concentration in the industry, right? So we lose a producer, that could potentially increase market power. This could be bad for employees, potentially bad for customers. That's the potential negative effect. The potential positive effect is we get a reallocation of resources, usually from less productive firms to more productive firms. So one possibility is when these mergers happen, these mergers are decided upon by smart, clever bankers who are deciding to merge, and when they do it, they're making good decisions, and it's reallocating resources from less productive to more productive banks. So my interpretation of Rohan's result is that that second effect is the one that is dominating, and that we should interpret the loss of a community bank, at least in many cases, not necessarily as a loss, but rather the local community gaining the synergy benefits, the productivity benefits that often happen with mergers. And again, I think we can view this as a merger happens and it can provide more resources to the local bankers who can then build on the relationships that they have and provide value to the local community. If you buy this, my kind of through line through all this, the kind of implication is that bankers are where the real value is, not necessarily in community banks. And you see this in each three of the three papers. Shohini shows us that when bankers are setting deposit rates, they do it with a lot of knowledge about the local economy and a lot of foresight about what's going to happen in the future. We can statistically look at their decisions and be able to have better forecasts of what's going to happen. Second, lending relationships, this is from Dimitro's paper, lending relationships are valuable and they persist even after the acquisition. Again, suggesting that the value might be in the bankers, not necessarily in the name on the bank. And then third, the acquisition of a bank, it tends to increase the value of local communities. And again, the way I view that is perhaps it's really bankers that are the value, and when these mergers happen, those bankers can actually be more productive and increase the value to the local community. So this is my take on these three papers. And again, if you haven't had a chance to look at them closely, I really recommend it. They're fascinating and they relate a lot to what we heard this morning.